I'm not going to be talking much about the project per se. I'm going to be talking about a topic that is very relevant to that specific project. And that is sort of centering the role of development stakeholders, us included, and getting landscape approaches off the ground. So really getting them initiated and getting them ultimately scaled. There we go. I'm going to focus specifically on two specific types of actors that play a really important role in both getting landscape approach off the ground, but also in socializing landscape approaches and giving a space to local stakeholders to explore this as an opportunity for their landscape. Specifically, I'll look at the donor community that provides finance to projects that plan to introduce landscape approaches. And specifically in sort of the early phases of project implementation that are really there to help design and develop the institutional and planning structures and strategies that sort of guide long-term integrated land use management. And the second one is bridging organizations. So for bridging organizations, I'm looking here at those institutions that can act as independent facilitators in the landscape, but don't have a meaningful stake in the landscape, so no vested interest, who primarily function in terms of getting landscape approaches off the ground and helping build linkages and relationships between actors, and also the necessary capabilities to engage in collaborative action. But above all else, provides the necessary technical guidance that is needed to develop the foundational elements of landscape approaches, which in my perspective are largely the institutional and planning structures. So with regards to donors, one thing what we're realizing, and this is also integrating the sort of working with the SILM project, is that what the SILM project is, it aims to support 23 EC supported landscape projects and tries to provide technical backstopping support. So we've had a very interesting look into how these projects were conceived. And one thing we're realizing is that donors like the European Commission, for example, should have very modest expectations. If there is a group of stakeholders who wants to implement the plan and approach, and we're talking about a typical funding window of say 3 years, really not much can be expected. I mean, much can be expected, but not in terms of the typical donor metrics. So the focus here is very much on the core building blocks. And the way we're seeing it is a landscape project that tries to establish itself and really stay true to the approach should spend a lot of time in establishing and socializing a common vision for the landscape. And Emily touched on this, about how complicated it is to establish a common vision and also a common vision that is inclusive of beneficiaries. A project like that should try to establish a multi-stakeholder planning and implementation structure, which is both equitable and provides equal voice. They should aim to co-develop a theory of change and implementation strategy to achieve that common vision, while at the same time also leveraging local knowledge, the resources and capabilities available to the stakeholders in the landscape, and above else, not close their eyes to complementary initiatives, of which there are usually many. But what we're noticing is that in order for those strategies to be viable and actionable, they really need to be informed by evidence. Too often, those multi-stakeholder planning processes are informed by subjectivities, personal biases, and also vested interest. So what then is there to consider as a donor? Okay, they have to realize the process this is time-consuming and complicated. It demands years of what many in the discipline call muddling through. And they should really not expect more than institutional structures, implementation strategies, and theories of change in the project cycle. If a project like that submits a proposal and says, okay, we aim to lift X many people out of poverty and conserve that many hectares of land, I, as a donor, will be extremely cautious. Those are projects that do not grasp the magnitude of really developing the foundational elements for an integrated landscape approach. And related to that is donors should consider who a project is being implemented by. And what we're seeing is that there is an acute awareness of what that means. Is that what we're seeing in the film projects, the technical support facility, is that many such projects are led by organizations that have personal stakes, that are not neutral, and that are largely using the landscape approach language to try to elevate and find follow-up funding for pre-existing interventions. And in situations like that, there is a risk that you rather exacerbate existing power differentials, and also there's a misuse of the language approach, of the landscape approach language, to legitimize actions that don't necessarily represent common visions of the landscape. And this is where bridging organizations like us, like CIFOR-ICRAF, come in. Bridging organizations play that role. They play that role of helping navigate the complex power dynamics, the vested interests, the capacity gaps, and above else, the legacy problems and the sunk cost fallacies, which often influence the directionality of landscape approaches. They're there to close knowledge gaps that frustrate informed decision making, and also to provide proper sequencing. And the figure on the right sort of demonstrates what a proper sequencing could look like. And in that, am I almost done?
Yes, 1 more minute.
Cool. And in that respect, by playing a facilitatory role, it is a very delicate balance between, on the one hand, orchestrating and providing direction to landscape planning, and also allowing and empowering stakeholders to own the process. And what we realized in GML is that if you give stakeholders too much free rein, then chances are that the strategies that come out of it are not viable, not necessarily actionable, and based on tenuous assumptions. And again, CIFOR-ICRAF has a comparative advantage in this space, but I think going forward, we have to be very, very careful. And we need to be guided by a coherent strategy and also coherent understanding of what landscape approaches are. We have a lot of different projects on that, and there seems to be very divergent interpretations. And I think if we are engaged in this space, which I think is the space to be engaged in, there are serious reputational risks and unintended consequences. And not least, what we're seeing is that when funding dries up, you take a 3-year project cycle, funding dries up, multi-stakeholder processes collapse. And there might be exceptions to the rule, but in the landscape we're working with GML, for example, there were 2 such processes before us. Both of them disappeared the moment funding was gone. So there is a moral duty, if we're engaged in this space, and the donors have a moral duty to ensure there is continuity. Because if we don't support, empower landscape approaches, multi-stakeholder planning in the long run, you risk turning people off to such approaches forever. And we have an important role. And I think our role is also helping donors better support and more targetedly finance proper landscape approaches. That's it. Thanks.